Can I go?
Almost. Speak.
You got it?
Ready? Wow, cool. Now I don't want to talk. All right. Sorry for the delay, guys. Aw. All right, I'm done.
Yeah. Go to the bar.
Can't get any. Hey, look, my applause won't get any better than that after the presentation, so we should stop now. How y'all doing? I'm going to take you through what the group that I work with at McAfee is doing with big data and with Yara and with signed malware and all things like that. I encourage you to ask questions along the way. Don't wait for QA or anything. But what the point of this presentation really is to show you that if you've got a big enough sample set, you can find nuggets of gold. You can actually find needles in haystacks. You can find needles in barnyards. But it's really predicated on having a ginormous friggin' set of data. So our initial goals when we went into this cluster was we wanted to bring sanity and numbers to things that really don't have a lot of sanity and numbers. Remember where I work, right? I work at McAfee, and we get lots and lots of malware, but the job of McAfee Labs at the end of the day is to detect it as quick as possible, as generically as possible, and say, all right, it's a Trojan, move on to the next 10,000. It's this, move on to the next 10,000. So the goal of the labs at the end of the day is to take all that data and use it to detect as much malware as generically and quickly as possible. But in the APG where I work, we have a different goal. We actually want to know specifically how much actor activity there is, how much of a specific piece of malware there is today. We also want to know how much there will be of it tomorrow. We want to know how much of it was there last week. We want to know where in the world it came from, right? So we want to answer very, very specific questions. So we're thankful that we actually have access to all the labs' data, because none of the research and none of the stuff that you're going to see up here would have been possible without several things, and I'll get to that in just a second, but it really is based upon a large amount of data. So we're asking the labs' data some very, very different questions. And we went into it with a couple of sets of questions. You know, we wanted to know if you're an FI, if you're a financial institution, and you're not this one. If you're Bank of America, how many times are you targeted per day? All right, Labs doesn't do a real good job of telling us things like that. Again, they tell us how much Trojans are out there, how much banking malware is out there, but they don't give us specific information a lot of the times, right? So we wanted to go in and ask all of these very, very specific questions. And specifically, we wanted to look into signed malware certificates, right? CAs, you know, that have their certs put on malware to make them whitelisted, right? Things like that. That's an area that we went into it thinking, oh, maybe there's 2% of the malware out there that actually has a signed key or something like that. So we wanted to answer all of these very, very deep questions, and we wanted to be able to answer it authoritatively. And so our initial assumptions going in is really size does matter. When I tell you how much malware we actually take in per day and how much data we actually look at per day, most people are kind of surprised. On any day of the week, we actually import from labs alone 500,000 plus pieces of malware. That's just that day, all right? That is a minimum amount that we actually take in. That's not the stuff that's already been minimally classified. The 500,000 samples we bring in every single day from labs is just the stuff that came in that day that hasn't been analyzed yet. So things like that are massive amounts of data. Yeah. Yes. 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 If you're asking me of the unknown ones that haven't been analyzed yet, how many of those are unique, that's a tough question to answer. But I'm going to give you some sanity to answer that question in just a second. Because the question is how much of it is unique, right? And that's a really, really good question. Because arguably, stuff that's created by a toolkit is not necessarily unique. It's binarily unique, meaning it's got, you know, MD5 is different. But it's a different hash, but if you rip it apart, it's the same functionality underneath, right? So that's the kind of stuff we actually want to, those are the kinds of questions we want to answer. Yara rules are amazing. If you don't know Yara, you're wrong. If you haven't learned Yara yet, you're wrong. Learn today, learn tomorrow. Yara rules, certain Yara rules are just awesome and sexy, but when you mate awesome Yara rules with a large data set, you get some phenomenal results. This was a big deal. We've had the benefit in the advanced programs group of leveraging a lot of people who are way smarter than us. Closed lists, closed mailing lists, the YAR exchange group, things like that. Honestly, none of this research could be done if we were not members of these other closed groups. And I cannot say thank you to the closed groups that allow us to use their YAR scripts and their data enough. I won't mention their names, but you get what I'm talking about. So collaboration really was the key to us. Another big deal here is going into it, we kind of figured real malware, real advanced stuff that's indicative of an advanced adversary is probably only a small set of malware. Most of the other stuff is going to be consumer grade malware, right? Stuff that's fake AV, crap like that, right? It's important, don't get me wrong when I say that, but it's not stuff that's indicative of this actor or this part of the world or that part of the world. It's all important, but those aren't the kind of questions we want to answer. So we figured it'd be about 15%. We figured that 5% of it or so, or maybe less than 5% of it would even be potentially attributable. Who reverses malware in here and who actually does malware research in here, right? Then you know better than I could explain that looking at code is not necessarily going to tell you who wrote the code, right? It doesn't really lend itself to that kind of analysis, at least not on an individual binary by binary point of view, right? But if you've got a huge set of malware and you can actually rip apart 10,000 samples that are all potentially APT1 or APT2 or APT3, you might go down the road of actually doing rudimentary kinds of attributional questions. And when I use the word attribution, I'm being specific to possible group affiliations. I'm not talking the difference between attributing it to you versus you. I'm talking broad group attribution, stuff like that. Make sense?
Attribution, you mean subsets of nationalities, regions?
All of that. And again, the assumption going in is only about 5% of it will be indicative of any particular group affiliation. The other problem you run into is everybody uses black hole. Everybody uses poison ivy. So just because you find poison ivy on your network doesn't mean the Chinese own you. It just means that you've got poison ivy on your network. And if you're only looking at the binary, you don't have enough information to do even rudimentary kinds of affiliations and attributions. So again, we're being very specific as to how we use the word and how authoritative we even think it is. Make sense? Cool. All right, and then lastly, we wanted to really start digging into Android malware, because if you look at the development curve of PC malware, 20 years, right? If you look at the development curve of Android malware, really 3 years of really cool activity. And everything in the Android space does everything that's in the PC space, but in a ridiculously shorter period of time. So we wanted to actually bring, again, some quantification and some sanity to those kinds of numbers as well. All right. So what we built in our lab is this. Everything we do is, and I apologize for the use of the word cloud in there. It's done tongue in cheek, right? It's a cloud. But the point is none of the specific research and analysis that we've done could be done if we did not have that big, humongous feed of data from the labs. So at this point, we import on a daily basis 500,000 unknown pieces of malware every single day of the week. That's just the unknowns. We could also be doing Trojans, viruses, assume dirty ones, assume dirty 2, 3, 4, 5. But quite honestly, the pipe just isn't big enough. That alone, a day's worth of 500,000 samples, every month is a terabyte of malware. That's a terabyte of malware. So, we're talking about a ridiculous amount of data with a ridiculous amount of metadata. All right. But if you want to find the 2% of stuff that is really out there, if you don't have access to that kind of sample set, you're probably going to either think your YARA rules suck or there's no real adversarial activity out there because you don't have a big enough pool of data to actually look at. Then we do our own magic. Part of the arrow from left to right is our installation of YARA, and we use a lot of YARA scripts from a lot of the closed groups again that have been good enough to share it with us. We also have our own replication engine, but we use only the YARA rules that are indicative of actors or certain types of cyber criminal activity, certain types of Russian groups and things like that. So we're not throwing rules that say, take me from generic Trojan to specific Trojan. We're looking at it for Citadel Rain versus Citadel Blitzkrieg. That's the kind of specificity we're actually looking for. And again, once we get into the results and stuff like that, had we not had that huge data set of the labs to leverage, we would not have been able to find even any results. The magic of having a huge data set really cannot be understated. We do a lot of dashboarding. with that, we're lucky that we have some great resources and we can do a lot of dashboarding from it. We have some specific Euro stuff. We've developed our own tools. We're spending a lot of time researching signed binary analysis, signed malware. And again, when I get into the dashboarding results in just a second, you'll see what I'm talking about. But we also have our own replication backend. So we have a gigantic farm of Cuckoo. We have a gigantic farm of technology called ValidEdge, which McAfee owns. So we actually have in our lab the ability to replicate 20,000 samples a day by ourselves. So again, we're not talking small analysis. We're not talking throwing 3 samples through Cuckoo. We're talking about throwing 10,000 samples through Cuckoo, but only of a specific result set. Make sense? All right. So we're going from the 500,000 a day down to the 300 that we really care about, and then fully replicating that, and then indexing everything back into the database. Make sense? Okay, cool. And we'll get to what we're doing later. But again, the magic here is the fact that anytime we run a query, we have the ability to pull back from McAfee Labs, and you'll see some of the results of the dashboarding that we're doing. Because again, the labs' goal at the end of the day is to produce a DAT file, right? And that's important if you're a consumer or if you're worried about generic malware. It's important to have that. The great thing is they have more data than they know what to do with. But it's structured in such a way to do DAT detection, DAT accuracy, DAT stuff, right? But we have the ability to pull it in so we can connect this MD5 to that MD5. Tell it which parents are related to it, which child MD5s are related to it. All right, does it have a key? What other pieces of malware are signed with that exact key? All that kind of stuff we have the ability to pull in from the labs on a dynamic basis. Make sense? Cool. All right. So some of the results. The way I broke down a lot of the results was this, is I just picked a day of all the imports and I gave a day's look from the point of view of using Yara to look for APTs. Again, apologies for the word, but you all know what we mean. And then a day's worth of results for looking at signed binaries. And then the whole corpus, since we've been doing this since April, we've got about 4 months worth of malware that we've actually analyzed through Yara and replication. So I'm going to show you a day's worth of analysis, and I'm going to show you 10 million samples worth of analysis, and you'll see the difference in some of the numbers, and they'll be very interesting and surprising. I hope. So this is 1 day's worth of results. I apologize if some of you people in the back can't see this very clearly. Hit me up later, and I'll walk you through the slides behind my keyboard if you want. So what you see here is one particular day of the week, 6/24, and on that day of the week, 516,000 pieces of malware we actually imported from the labs, and we threw about 50 or so very specific Yara rules at it. This particular resulting dashboard is all about APT results. So agent downloader is indicative of who? Comment crew. XOR JavaScript is indicative of a lot of things. Over here we've got image stego, which is indicative of a different Chinese actor group. Over here we've got Ixi, which is indicative of a different Chinese actor group. So again, we're using very specific rules to hunt for very specific things. I do not give a crap about generic Trojans. All I care about is finding the 2 or 3% that have the markers of Ixi or Pression or this or that or the other thing. So we're discarding a lot of the other stuff and only focusing in on the stuff that actually hits. And if you're familiar with Yara, Yara is basically strings on steroids, right? You know, so it's throwing strings at the binaries and stuff, looking for very specific things. And it's got a false positive rate that's ridiculously low. So generally when you get a hit, it's a good hit. So think about this for a minute. All right, 516,000 samples and 92 hits on agent downloader. 92 out of 516,000 binaries that day. That's not a false positive. All right, if it was a pie like this, and it was 200,000 out of it, I would think it was a false positive. You can do some down selecting and stuff in there. But again, we see very low percentages. And if I was to do this across separate days, this is the 24th. If I was to do the 25th, 26th, and 27th, these ranges are very similar day to day. So even though the binary set in the data import is completely different, the ranges stay at about the same. If you were to add up this whole pie, it's actually about 100 binaries out of 516,000 that are actually indicative or have the markers of what would be considered adversarial malware. And that's just not the Chinese. There's a lot of other stuff in there. Apologies that some of the fonting is a little bit small. Hit me up later. But you'll notice there's other things in here. We've got Zeus at the binary level. We've got Dark Soul up here. We've got Web Injects. All of this stuff we would not have been able to find if the data set we were looking at was not ginormous. This dashboard doesn't show that. We've got separate stuff we're doing that can answer a lot of those questions, submission information and where it was gathered. This particular set of analysis doesn't tell us that, though.
Is it mostly English, or do you have?
All over the place. It's all over the place. You know, and that's a good part about the labs, right? Is global collections. You know, this is indicative of the world's collections. It's not just from North America or this or that or the other thing. It would be easy for me, or it'd be easy for us to cross-reference it, but it's just not reflected in this dashboard or anything like that.
How is it collected by your labs?
Lots of different ways.
Customers, or?
The question is, how are those binaries collected? They're collected a couple of different ways. Historically, the labs gets most of its collections from customer submissions historically, but that's a little bit different now. We have a lot of honeypots out there, a lot of other third-party collectors. We get big imports from all the big collectors daily. We get big imports from VirusTotal. We share samples with competitors. So there's a lot of different stuff that actually brings stuff into the labs. We have our own collections capability in our lab and stuff like that. But historically, the biggest is from customers submitting binary X and saying, "What is this?" So that's historically the largest chunk. Make sense? Cool. Was there a hand over there? Yeah.
Is GTI part of that?
Not this view. Not this view. When we get to some of the dashboards, some of the other stuff that we're doing, it actually is. The question is GTI, Global Threat Intelligence, part of this, and it's not. You don't know what GTI is. The answer doesn't really matter to you. If you do, it's a great answer, right? All right, so moving on. But I'll get to some of that stuff later. This is a day's worth of the same sample set, but the rules that I down selected here are indicative of Russian cybercrime malware. All right, very financial, very FI focused. If you're in the financial institutions, a lot of it is actually either Russian or proxied through. Where's the magic word? Where's Poland? Oh, it's not up there. Anytime you see a hit on Poland, that's always very, very interesting if you're seeing it in a large sample set. A lot of the hits that we get, XOR JavaScript is gigantic, huge amount of web injects we're actually seeing. Small amount of Zeus, small amount of other downloader activity, small amount of SpyEye. That's kind of a false every once in a while, and then a lot of kernel XORing. And again, this is what we use as our initial down select to say, okay, these are the ones I want to replicate. And even though it's a big pie, that hit for XOR JavaScript, 166 out of 516,000 samples. That's good. Those are the ones I want to look at. Those are the ones we want to rip apart. Those are the ones we want to replicate. Those are the ones we want to un-XOR. These are the ones we want to look at. So you take the universe of stuff that came in that day, and you get down to literally the less than 1% of stuff you want to look at. But thank God we have the huge data set, because we would never have been able to get to that particular resultant. Make sense? Cool. All right. So moving on to some signed binaries. What this is a breakdown of, again, just this day, looking at all the binaries that we actually brought in. If they're signed, who's signing key, and what CA actually signed that particular binary, right? So you got VeriSign, 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 Thought, Komodo, Android, VeriSign, 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 Thought, VeriSign, 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 VeriSign. Lots of VeriSign, all right? Not all of these turn out to be malicious. Some of these simply turn out to be suspicious, like fake AV and, you know, fake system tools and stuff like that. But every single one of these is signed with a valid key from VeriSign or from Komodo or from whoever. A huge amount, actually the largest amount, this pie is Android related. Huge amount of signing actually going on in the Android world. Why? Who said that? Because it has to, right? Because it's required to have a sign on the to actually have the binary signed, right? Very good point. That's exactly right. So this is 1 day's worth of activity, and this is just bringing in the binaries themselves and saying, does it have a certificate MD5? Whose certificate MD5 actually is it? These we will then oftentimes replicate. I actually, through this methodology, we actually found the only piece of malware signed with a valid Microsoft key. That's cool. All right, but again, if you don't have the 500,000 you can bring in per day, you're not going to find the Microsoft key. If you have that kind of sample set, you're going to find the Microsoft key. All right, so this that are signed. Oh, it's small. It's like 0.001% is actually signed malware. I'll give you the resultant numbers actually at the end, but it's a teeny set that's actually signed on a daily basis. So of the 516,000, the biggest hit is 31. That's the biggest hit, and it's a VeriSign key. 31 binaries signed with the same VeriSign key. I want to make that clear. This VeriSign one is a different VeriSign certificate MD5 key. All right, you see where I'm going? So all of the VeriSign ones are not signed with the same key. They're all signed with different keys. Different keys get abused for different reasons. The key itself is not malicious. The usage of the key in relation to the binary makes it malicious. Make sense? Cool. All right, so jumping forward over looking at a couple of months worth of activity. And the looking over a couple of months makes it even more interesting because if you think you only see some things every once in a while daily, you even see more interesting things sometimes on a monthly basis or like a half yearly basis, right? Like think about Wiper or Dark Soul and stuff like that, right? The things that are actually really interesting to rip apart. You only get to see stuff like that over longer periods of time. So we were actually able to find, through this type of analysis and using Yara, new Citadel Rain variants, a really nasty Dark Magie rootkit, and some other Zeuses. But look at the numbers on this. That's 111 out of just shy of 10 million samples. All right? Talk about needles and haystacks, right? But we replicated these, and they actually are brand new Citadel variants that we had never seen before. Very specific campaigns against very specific financial targets. Same thing for Dark Megi. Nasty, nasty, nasty rootkit. But again, talking 125 there. 0.000001% of the actual sample set. So again, had we not had the large sample set, we wouldn't have been able to actually figure this out. But we see a ridiculous amount. A lot of stuff is not resultant to the pi, like all the XORing, that we actually see ridiculous amounts of XORed malware. And usually we don't run into a binary that's XORed with one key. Keep me honest here, Marco. We run into a binary that's XORed with 10, 15, 20 different keys and stuff like that. So generally when we see one hit, it'll be JavaScript 20, 30, 40, 50, kernel at a different space. So generally when we see one, we see lots and lots of others. And again, that makes it interesting to look at. When you've got a piece of malware that hits on Zeus or it hits on Citadel Rain, and it hits on something that's XORed, and it hits on a certain bank target, that makes it interesting to look at. But had we not had that sample set to do that kind of down select, we wouldn't have been able to get to that kind of needle in a friggin' barnyard resultant. Pretty cool.
So with respect to the signed binaries, let's take the example of the one signed with the Microsoft key. Is that indicative that a Microsoft key was compromised from Microsoft, or that some registrar somewhere issued something that says it's from Microsoft?
This level of analysis doesn't allow me to answer that question. My best guess would be it's a valid key that was compromised. It's not a forged key. It's because it comes up as valid, by the way. So most of the time, it's through either a third-party affiliate. So I got my Microsoft key through this other affiliate downstream because they're not forged. It's actually a valid key. And I'll show you the associations later because that piece of malware was actually distributed by the same group, but they only distributed one binary that actually was signed. So there's 10 or 15 other pieces of malware that they distributed. Only one of them is actually signed with the Microsoft key. The others are regular malware. Kind of cool. All right, so moving on a little bit here. Again, this is one of the this is a bit more of an actor view. You know, again, trying to really quantify and break out how much activity are we seeing of APT1 versus APT versus A3 versus Violent Panda versus Managed Panda versus this versus that versus the other thing. And I'm not going to go on record and say this tells us that. This tells us the markers of the malware that we're actually seeing on a daily basis, quarterly basis, monthly basis, whatever. So it's indicative of activity. Doesn't make it necessarily that group because people like to share code, right? But it is a good way of saying of the stuff that we're seeing daily, 2% of it is potentially has the markers of APT1 versus the markers of APT2. That is good information to have. That is actually intelligence as opposed to generic malware, generic this, generic that. Another different view of some of the same information, but the results that we found, Net Traveler, one binary. Net Traveler, one binary.
Talk louder when you get away from the mic.
I do, or I don't?
Talk louder when you get away
If
from
I don't want to. Thanks, Les. I appreciate that. So, Net Traveler result, new Net Traveler result here.
What?
Brand new Disk Wiper here. Brand new Dark Moon Ghost Trojan variant over there. These are individual hits, actually. That's one hit, that's one hit, that's one hit, that's one hit. Out of almost 10 million samples, we're actually able to find individual hits within that sample set.
There we go.
Smarty pants, Scott. Moving on to some of the, am I standing in your, I apologize if I'm standing in your way here, guys. But if I go stand over there, they're going to complain that they can't hear me in the back because they're rude. They're rude like that. Now, screw them. You know, that's right. Screw you people. Screw you people in the back. I should have thought about that before. Again, this is another view. This is that same view of signed binaries just over the entire sample set. And you'll notice a bigger breakout of Android. You'll notice that VeriSign is not numerically the first one. It's actually DigiCert. Komodo is up there. Thought is up there. But when you step back and and in another screen, I'll actually show you when we added them together so you can actually see which ones are abused the most out in the wild and stuff like that. Some of the numbers are absolutely fascinating. From this view, it's not even a 1% problem. So again, from this view, it's not a 1% problem. If you were to just look at the Android collections from the day, it's 24%. You know, so it's a big deal. Some of them are actual Android keys. Some of them are self-signed keys. Some of them are self-created keys, but they're all keys and they're all valid. Let's be honest, it works, right? You know, who looks at, yes, who reads the permissions? Nobody, right? So it'll work forever. So very, very interesting results here. The other column is individual CN certificates. So we actually were able to see a whole breakdown of keys coming out of China, and you literally one for each binary, one for each binary, one for each binary. Good stuff. And here's, again, just a different view of trying to attribute it more to certain group affiliations or certain group activities. This is, again, over the entire month's period of time. 2,667 attributable to APT1, less than that attributed to APT3, less than that attributed to different groups within there. The total count actually turned out to be 6,000 samples were potentially attributable out of 10 million. So, good stuff. Good stuff. Again, we would not have been able to get these results were it not for the big data, and bless the hearts of the closed groups that we're members of, because it's their rules that we actually are running against a lot of this. We have some of our own stuff internally that we've written, but a lot of these do come out of those closed groups, and it's fantastic. So if you've got the sample set size, they're findable. If you've got a smaller sample set size, it doesn't mean the SIG is bad, it doesn't mean the intelligence is bad, it just means you don't have a large enough set to look at to actually get to the 2 or 3. This is 6,000 out of 10 million in 4 months, all right? Got to have the 10 million to get to the 6,000, or be ridiculously lucky, right? And I don't believe in luck. Was their hand, sir?
Yeah. Are you tracking politically sensitive events and people?
Not from this level. Not from this level. We've talked about doing that, but it's not from the binary level. There's other ways to actually track and break that out that are just not reflective of this kind of analysis. So yes, but just not up here. All right. So of some visualizations the team worked up over the last couple of days. This is a view, and again, I apologize that the fonting is a little bit small. What we did is we took the top 25 keys, top 25 certificates, CAs, that we found in the sample database, McAfee Labs' sample database, and we said of all the binaries that we have in the database, rank them by certificate key. So what you see there is a thought code signing key from CAG2. The actual subject name is infinity here, and the number of binaries that this key is signed with in the McAfee Labs database, 507,000. 507,000 pieces of malware signed with just that one key. The key next to it, that thought key, 515,000 individual binaries are signed with that one key. You just add these two keys together, it's a million friggin' samples signed by just those two keys alone. And then the rest of it goes down from there. So thought actually turns out to be, which is from this view kind of interesting, because you would think it would be VeriSign or something like that, but actually the number 1 and 2 keys are thought, and these are different keys. This view is not actually supposed to show only malicious binaries that it's associated with, but it turns out that for these two, it's all malicious binaries. The breakdown of them is this. So the first one breaks out like this. The first key breaks out with lots and lots and lots of unknowns, lots of actual assumed dirties and viruses and different levels. This is Trojan, this is PUP. These are unknowns, so these haven't been analyzed yet, but they'll turn out to be, historically most unknowns turn out to be malicious at some level. So this particular sample, and also this is Android, that key is on 500,000 Android APKs, and they're malicious. So huge issue. The next thought key that we actually looked at, sorry about that, is on the PC platform, all of these puffs. So this particular key was used to actually sign over 300,000 different pieces of fake AV, fake system tools, and things like that. There's actually even some Mac malware in this number. I pulled into the numbers a little bit. There's even some Mac numbers in there. Not any Linux numbers that I found, but there are some Mac numbers in there. So this particular key was wicked dirty because every single thing in here, with the exception of 200 binaries, were dirty. 200 binaries out of that 500,000 were clean. Everything else was either a pup, dirty, Trojan, virus, or whatever.
Question.
Sir?
Has stop revoked those signing keys?
Nope.
So the communication, are you guys reaching out to
Nope.
them, by the way? Or?
Nope. Nope. We'll get there. Hopefully, we'll get there. But I don't have a direct bat line channel to say, here, thought, here's my daily, these keys are bad day. Yeah. Possibly. I mean, that's one of the discussions of what to do with the research, right? Which I have a slide on of what to do with the research. But you'll notice on the left-hand side, valid key, sign date, expiration date. It's the 2014 key. So it's still actually valid out there. We're having discussions internally what to do with this kind of information. Do you give it to VeriSign? Things like that, right? I mean, that's pretty hardcore analytical evidence, right? What? Yep. I hear you. Yep, I hear you.
Dave, you said there's 200 good samples you're signed.
Mhm.
That it's known bad actors. Can you explain why there's good non-malicious?
Well, the key itself isn't malicious. The usage of the key is malicious, right? So, you and I both go to VeriSign, or we go to an affiliate that creates us a key and gives us a key. You use it to sign stuff that's actually valid software. I use it to sign malicious software. So it's not that the key is invalid. The key's fine. It's just being used maliciously. So the argumentation that gentleman would make is, look, thought, VeriSign, here's 500,000 examples of this key being abused or misused. You should probably consider invalidating that key.
I'm just going to keep compromised. That's
Yep. It's not that the key is compromised. It's just the key is being used in a malicious manner. I won't go down the route of saying it's compromised or anything like that.
got a conduit in there, insider,
Bingo.
whatever.
Bingo. That's exactly right. So it can be used for good, bad, or indifferent purposes. But I've got 500,000 examples of two of your keys being used for very malicious purposes. So it's that kind of discussion we want to look to have with them long term. Make sense? Cool. All right, so moving on here. I'm almost out of time, even though I started late.
Dave,
Sir?
you talked about intermediary keys, right?
Yes and no. See, here's the thing. Look at the issuer, right? You got the issuer name up there. Potentially, it's an intermediary key, which is the problem you have with fake AV historically anyway, right? And pups and spyware, right? The main company is a good company, but its downstream affiliates are the ones doing all the dirt, right? Arguably, it's probably the same thing here. So the affiliate you get from VeriSign, that you got your key from VeriSign, who is easier to get the key from than going to VeriSign itself, because it's easier to get the key from the downstream than it is from the other guy. That's where I think the abuse actually happens. And you could actually, there are sites that allow you to submit a binary, and it'll pump out a signed binary to you, $29.95. And it's signed by a VeriSign or a Thought or a Komodo key and stuff. So the services are out there and available.
So would you agree that the systemic problem is the ability to get keys for?
Yep. It's the system itself that's easily abusable, right? And the gentleman who made the comment of the reason you see more signed keys in Android is because Android requires signed binaries. That's exactly the reason you see signed binaries in Android. That's a great statement. All right, so what did we learn from this? We learned that if you actually do have a big enough sample set, you can answer some pretty cool questions. Most of our assumptions turned out to be about right. Less than 15% is something that we would consider interesting enough to look at. Take that with a grain of salt. Not everything that we would look at is necessarily what you would look at, but of the sample set, a little less than 15% is interesting or indicative of advanced malware. That I found to be a very interesting marker. Of the whole sample set we looked at, that's about what we were seeing with new and interesting Zeus and Citadel variants. And that's the right-hand side of the bell curve if you're going to do cybercrime, or if you're going to do Russian cybercrime and stuff like that. And that's 0.0014 out of, again, 10 million samples. So, again, very small amount of real activity. Think about that. You can hide in the noise very, very easily. You can hide within generic malware very, very simply. All right? Web injects consistent, and all these are consistent numbers, by the way. We consistently see at about that range. Every single day, the web injects are at about 0.26. That goes in line with the cybercrime stuff, right? These are where we focus a lot of our research on, is the Ixchis, net travelers, Tidors, and impressions of the world. Every single day, we see within the same number every single day. And it's about the 0.026 number as well. So it's out there, it's quantifiable. The numbers are very, very low, but that's kind of what you figure when you're talking about what people would call an APT, right? You would figure you're going to see small amounts of it. We're seeing small amounts of it. This particular one, if you had to look at one XOR key, that's the XOR key to look at, because this rule hits 15% of the time across the sample set if you're not careful. So a lot of malware is XORed with that. It's prevalent, consistent every single day. That was kind of interesting. Lots of XORed malware out there. If you un-XOR your malware and throw YAR against it again, you get better results, by the way, if you can do it. It's not easy. Digitally signed. This is consistent at 0.1. 29% of the dailies. This is the difference between those views of what do we see daily versus what does the whole back end of McAfee Labs say, right? The back end says thought. The dailies, 29% is actually VeriSign. So VeriSign is hugely abused on a daily basis, just from the submissions that we actually see. Thought and Komodo are numbers 2 and 3. And Android, man, of all the Android malware we get every single day, 21 out of 4 are signed with a key, and it's usually a VeriSign key. Pretty cool stuff. So the next steps, we're trying to expand the data set past just unknowns. We're trying to implement the Yara subsystem on the back end of McAfee Labs proper, so we can actually turn it loose on the entire back end. Think about doing this stuff across 110 million samples. You know, you take it from generic Trojan to specific classification and quantification. That's cool. You know, when you can actually break out what used to be 100 million generic samples into the specific groups of affiliations, you can answer interesting questions. You turn your data into intelligence when you're doing something like that, right? As opposed to, it's a Trojan. Thank you, guys. But if you can actually say, of those Trojans, these are Ixchi, these are Prussian, these are this, these are that, these are the other things, that gets very, very cool. So we're looking to implement it on the back end, or bring in more samples on a daily basis, but it's hard. 500,000 samples is ridiculous. Over a VPN link between here and Beaverton? Try that. I dare you. I dare you. Yara mapping rules. So what we're actually trying to do a better job of is, if you look on some of these slides, like right here, you see the resultant hit, right? So you see image stego, right? That's indicative of a particular group. You have to know what group that's indicative of. So we're trying to go through a lot of the Yara rules and actually recategorize them. So instead of it saying APT win generic _ image stego, we actually affiliate it with the 6 or 7 groups that are known to use that particular malware, so we can bring a bit of better quantification to that. Because again, I think it's important to know out of how much of your activity is possibly this group or that group. That kind of stuff is important to know. Your strategy is better, your defenses are better when you know it's cybercrime versus Chinese actors or Korean actors. You have to react to them differently. And by better grouping our results, we can do a better job of that. Let me jump ahead here. Sorry about that. Boop, 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 boop. Here we are. We're already at the point where we're doing automatic replication, well, somewhat. So for instance, once we've pulled down the stuff that's indicative of a certain actor, we automatically replicate it and index it back into the database. That makes sense. And then we are thinking about rerunning it or possibly un-XORing it to get better results. Because again, if you can un-XOR your binaries and then throw Yara against your un-XORed binaries, you get better results. They're good against XORed binaries. They're much more precise against un-XORed binaries for obvious reasons. But that ain't easy to do on 3 samples a day, let alone doing it on an order of magnitude, which is what we're trying to do. So we're working on it. And then, because this is, I think, an important step, let's say you find 27 binaries today that are indicative of this Chinese actor or that Russian actor or this one. What do you do with it? Do you just put it in the DATs? No, you create IOCs out of it, right? So you can actually implement the IOCs in the customer environment. Find out if you've been owned by that particular actor. Or if you do your IOCs correctly, you don't look for one particular piece of malware. You look for the broader indicator of that group's malware. So we're actually working on automating the process of bringing in 500,000 a day and creating a small subset of IOCs out of it. It's still very alpha at this point. My commitment to you guys, our commitment to you guys is this, is if you send me rules, I will send you results. All right, so if you know how to write rules, if you know how to write Yara rules, I will throw them against the biggest sample set of malware on planet Earth, and I will give you the results. If that's sharing binaries back, I'm perfectly fine with that. We're okay with that. We can give you give me rule X and I get results. I'm happy to share back the results with you, whether that's the binaries themselves or just the MD5s, because I think we can all do this better together than we could apart. We have data. We have lots of data. You guys have more knowledge about writing good APT rules and Yara rules and Yara scripts than we do. You give me rules, I'll give you results. That is our promise to you. Questions? Sir?
So is the takeaway for the bad guys that we just need to get better at writing string application techniques?
Yes and no. That's a good question. You know, here's the thing. Look, at the end of the day, they win. Okay, they have a leg up on you every day, no matter what you're doing. But we don't have a real good idea of who's active on a daily basis, right? Because again, if you think about the way most AV companies work and most security companies work, if you have a large customer base, generic detection. So we don't really know who is active out there and who is not active out there because we don't quantify and classify deep enough. So they already do a good job of obfuscating their code. We, because we have to look at 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 samples, can only do very high level analysis, not deep level analysis. That's what they know. They know that they can hide within the markers of generic malware and change one or two things and no, look, he's using poison ivy. It must be a Chinese actor. No, I'm just using poison ivy, you idiot. You know, because I know you'll think if I'm using poison ivy, I'm a Chinese actor. It's not the case. So they understand that very well. I just think we have to do a better job of quantifying. We have to move past detection to classification and identification. That was a long answer. I apologize for that. Questions? Any others? Sir?
I got one. So, your guys' system, I imagine, a lot of automation involved, right? I mean, you're dealing with tons and tons of samples. So how are you guys handling things like virtualization, obfuscation, and evasion techniques?
Sure.
I mean, a lot of the time they'll wait 5 minutes, you know, with the actual binary drop and load the memory.
That's a great question. That's a great question. We struggle with that sometimes, but let me show you part of the architecture here, and that answers that question. There's a reason we don't just use Cuckoo. Cuckoo is good for certain things. Cuckoo is not good for other things, right? But if you'll see that little thing that says Valid Edge in the top left-hand side, that's a company we acquired a while ago that makes virtualization and packing irrelevant. So I can throw 10,000 heavily encrypted, obfuscated ones that will evade sandboxes through that, and it's irrelevant. It's irrelevant. It'll actually give us the malware down to source. So that's why we don't just have one thing on the back end. We automate and down select as much as possible. So when we get to the point that we want to replicate, it's only the 10 or 20 that we really want to replicate, and we've got the technologies that can handle it appropriately. That's exactly right. And if we know it's got it, then we'll throw it through one. If we know it doesn't have it, we'll throw it through the lower hanging one. But we struggled with that for a long time, which is why most do high order string analysis. We only use the string analysis to get us to the 2% or 3% we actually want to fully replicate. And then the goal of the replication is to get the output of the replication into IOC format potentially. Because then that's cool, right? Because then you've got not just the 10 things that sample does, but the keys it goes after, the ports. Those are the interesting parts. That's what you turn into your IOC. Because then if you find those 5 keys, that's indicative of being owned by an actor set rather than just look for pression, right? That's available. Yeah, we're looking at it. Yeah, we're looking at it. We're looking at both of them. It's just coming down to which one is easier for us to implement. And then we have to... That's exactly. Stigs is interesting. Open IOC is real good for a lot of things. It doesn't do some things, but it does do others. But there you go. So my time is up. If anybody wants to hit me up later, feel free. I'm around. So I thank you for your time. I apologize for Skydogs messing up my presentation because it didn't technically work correctly. Thank you all.
That's the only thing I'm gonna mess up, boy.
Now I bet. Well done, sir.
I'm gonna mess up the front part of your fist.
Oh, that's just mean. That's just mean. He's mean.